Welcome to the debate. So today we're tackling something it's one of the most complicated and frankly passionately argued questions in global boys love discourse, the impact of state control on artistic output. We're comparing two giant creative ecosystems, the Thai BL industry, where creators have, relative freedom, and the Chinese BL industry, where state restrictions are severe.
And it's an essential comparison. I mean, the content from both regions has just dominated the global fandom for the last decade. The sheer volume of this stuff means that how these stories are told has real-world cultural consequences.
Exactly. So the central, challenging question is this. Does mandatory censorship, the kind we see enforced in China, does it actually enhance creativity and lead to a potentially superior aesthetic art form? Or does it fundamentally destroy the authenticity and truth that's essential to the genre? I'll be arguing for the idea of constraint-driven innovation, that when certain doors are closed, creative genius finds new ways through.
And I'm coming at it from, a different angle. I see that necessity can be the mother of invention, sure, but I maintain that these restrictions are fundamentally tools of suppression. They suppress truth, they erase queer identity, and they silence the very stories of validation that the genre is meant to provide. For me, artistic freedom and emotional honesty have to come first.
Storytelling that has to rely less on narrative shortcuts. It's frustrating, yes, but you can't deny that in Chinese BL, or what they officially call danmei, or, rebranded bromance, the inability to portray romance openly has pushed creators to invent an entire visual and symbolic language. Intimacy has to be built through pure cinematography, advanced symbolism, character parallels, and just incredibly detailed micro-expressions. The visual execution has to be flawless because the explicit script is forbidden.
That's certainly true. They've developed some very effective workarounds, but I really struggle to call that innovation when the constraint is just political erasure.
Well, look at the evidence. When The Untamed couldn't explicitly feature a romantic pairing, the creative team transformed the bond into a spiritual, destined relationship, a kind of wuxia soulmate connection, using musical motifs, shared items like swords and flutes, protective gestures, very specific visual mirroring. This created a mythological depth that honestly very few free-form Thai series ever achieve. Or look at Word of Honor. It conveyed this deep, agonizing longing entirely through careful color palettes, veiled poetry references, and these highly choreographed interactions. When physical shortcuts like a kiss or a confession are stripped away, the burden shifts entirely to the actor's eyes and the director's lens. And that pressure cooker environment, it often produces more poetic, more cinematic work. The audience is forced to engage intellectually, to read between the lines, which really elevates the whole experience.
That's a compelling argument, and I agree. The production values and the resulting subtlety are often absolutely stunning. But I just don't buy that this art is superior when its core truth has been systematically removed and replaced with allegory. Restrictions don't create art, they mandate evasion. BL becomes officially bromance. A romance becomes a loyal partnership. Queer characters have to be best friends or spiritual allies. The audience has to decode everything, simply because the creators are forbidden from saying what the story is actually about. This isn't a sophisticated choice, it's forced survival.
But it's survival that generates high art, nonetheless.
But this requires the systematic removal of the most critical elements of queer representation. We lose the emotional climax of a love confession, the honest struggle of coming out, the reality of discrimination, the path to family acceptance. All of these validating LGBTQ+ themes they're completely forbidden. That's not innovation, it's state-mandated censorship that results in systematic erasure. And I'd argue that Thai BL, because it is free, is allowed to be honest. And that honesty translates into genuine genre diversity and thematic depth. We see psychological thrillers, mature character dramas, slice-of-life stories that tackle everything from trauma and mental health to political corruption. Writers can explore identity openly, which is the heart of this genre. Restrictions suppress truth, freedom allows the full spectrum of human experience to flourish.
I see why you'd think that artistic freedom is the prerequisite for authenticity,
But let's delve deeper into the artistic merit of subtlety versus outright honesty and focus on the cinematic execution. I still maintain that the required subtext elevates Chinese BL aesthetically because of that higher budget and higher cinematic demand. These aren't just well-shot dramas. The constrained storytelling fundamentally changes the way directors direct and actors act.
How so?
Well, because the actors can't rely on the script to convey romance, they have to communicate it through this extreme control over their gaze, their body language. So directors focus the cinematography on these micro-expressions. Think about the use of shallow depth of field, or those sharp focus pulls onto a shared glance, or a hand just hovering near another. You see that all the time in a series like Word of Honor. These are technical choices designed to make the unspoken thing the narrative centerpiece. When the industry is mandated to avoid physical intimacy, the skill required to sell that relationship through sheer atmosphere and performance just skyrockets. And this is what results in these accidental masterpieces, where the high aesthetic quality is a direct byproduct of the necessary evasion.
I'm sorry, but I just can't agree that the technical skill justifies the ethical trade-off. It's an interesting point on acting pedagogy, but the high aesthetic quality, it risks overlooking the fundamental harm of erasure. While you're championing the technique, the cost from a representation perspective is severe. Zero explicit acknowledgement of LGBTQ+ lives. The romantic arcs are systematically rewritten, and they usually end in tragic ambiguity or forced separation.
But that intense use of metaphor, the silk threads, the shared umbrellas, the symbolic ink, it doesn't just exist to evade the censors. It connects modern queer expression to centuries of traditional Chinese male intimacy. The kind you find in wuxia literature and classical poetry, where these deep, non-sexual yet soul-binding male bonds were celebrated. It makes the story feel intrinsically linked to historical narrative traditions.
That's a compelling argument about the cultural depth, and I understand the intellectual satisfaction of decoding that classical language. I do. However, I would frame it differently. Is art that requires decoding truly superior to art that provides immediate, unambiguous validation for a marginalized community? The subtlety you praise often means the mainstream audience, the regulators, the general public, can safely interpret it as friendship. The story can only succeed commercially by denying its core subject matter.
But that's precisely the power of it. It operates on two registers at the same time. The fandom knows the true story, and the mainstream sees a chaste historical drama. It proves that the human desire for connection and narrative truth can successfully get around the iron fist of state control, and in doing so, create a sophisticated work of resistance.
Resistance through denial is still denial. Emotional honesty, which Thai BL excels at, the ability to show a full, complex relationship arc, including intimacy, negotiation, and everyday struggles, is just more valuable to the community than aesthetic atmosphere or cinematic subtlety. High artistry cannot compensate for zero representation. We need stories where queer characters can exist openly within the text, not just in the subtext.
Okay, let's discuss that freedom then, because this brings us directly to genre scope and genre, and quality control. Thai BL's freedom certainly allows for risk-taking and creates a vital pipeline for new LGBTQ+ talent, focusing on that diversity of stories. But I'm not convinced that freedom automatically equates to quality.
The freedom allows stories about societal expectations, identity crises, family rejection, things that are impossible under censorship. It lets the genre evolve past just high school settings and move into mature themes.
I agree the scope is broader, but we have to acknowledge the commercial realities. Thai BL sometimes suffers from significantly lower budgets, which impacts technical quality, and, critically, an over-reliance on BL formulas. When explicit scenes or fan service moments like the obligatory kiss after an accidental fall or the forced cohabitation trope become the guaranteed commercial selling point, the writing can get weaker. Chemistry often replaces deep, nuanced writing.
That is a fair critique of the formulaic nature that can emerge in any commercially successful open market. Yes, but that freedom also allows us to see genre evolution, like the shift towards the mature, dialogue-heavy series we've seen recently. They're actively pushing past those tropes. The Chinese system, on the other hand, ensures that the pressure is entirely about concealing, not about advancing narrative complexity.
I disagree. The constraint mandates deep writing because the acting and visual storytelling must carry the entire narrative weight. That pressure cooker system ensures the visual execution has to be impeccable. Where Thai BL might use explicit dialogue or a kiss to resolve romantic tension, Chinese BL has to invent a 15-second sequence using lighting, music, and performance to achieve the same emotional beat without violating censorship. That required invention elevates the craft.
That's an interesting point, though I'd frame it differently. The invention is used to communicate something we already know, the romance, without being allowed to name it. And the real struggle here is the emotional and narrative cost of censorship. Chinese BL often builds this amazing chemistry, this intense, subtle tension. And then what happens? It's often destroyed in the final episode with these vague, tragic, or just agonizingly ambiguous endings imposed purely to satisfy regulators.
You're referring to the state-mandated pain.
Exactly. That is not a sophisticated artistic choice. It is state-mandated pain for the audience, particularly the queer audience, who invested emotionally in seeing themselves represented. The narrative is often betrayed, and the audience is left with this profound sense of emotional dissonance and anger, not some poetic resolution. The artistic subtlety is undermined by the final, forced institutional betrayal.
I acknowledge the pain, and the systemic flaw of rewriting endings under duress it's undeniable. It's frustrating to invest in a journey only to have the conclusion diluted. However, let me offer a different perspective. I would argue that the process of building that intense symbolic tension over many episodes, even if it culminates in an ambiguous, unstated conclusion, demonstrates a tremendous narrative command that's driven despite the restriction.
But the ending proves the restriction won.
The struggle itself makes the resultant symbolism stronger, perhaps tragically so. By denying the audience the explicit payoff, the narrative adheres to a kind of enforced classical tragic structure, where forbidden love can never be openly realized. This can be interpreted not just as evasion, but as a meta-commentary on the systemic impossibility of queer joy in that environment. And crucially, that very ambiguity allows the audience to write their own ending, which deepens their engagement and ownership of the story.
I see why you might analyze it as a sophisticated meta-commentary, but to the viewer who is starving for validation, it is simply erasure. Why should the burden of completing the narrative fall onto the consumer? The true emotional honesty comes from the Thai model, where if the characters fall in love, they can kiss, they can confess, and they can face the world together, even if that world is messy or imperfect. That immediate emotional validation is far more essential than any amount of high-budget cinematography.
But that immediate validation, while necessary, sometimes leads to flat narrative arcs where the only obstacle is external, the world's refusal to accept them, not internal or structural. The restrictions in the Chinese model force the conflict to be internal, pushing the narrative and the acting skill to extraordinary heights to communicate that tension. It is a creative flowering driven by political suppression.
The flowering of a beautiful lie, maybe.
Perhaps, but a lie told with extraordinary cinematic skill.
So to summarize my position, artistic sophistication and high production value, no matter how visually subtle and beautiful they are, cannot compensate for the ethical cost of systematically suppressing truth and erasing identity. The core mission of the genre is validation, visibility, and representation. Only the Thai model, through its freedom, allows the queer community to truly see itself and explore identity openly, tackling real-world trauma and societal expectations without hiding behind metaphors. That is the heart and soul of the genre, and that freedom is non-negotiable for true artistic merit.
And I would maintain that while the Thai model excels in a motion of honesty, which is invaluable, the systemic restrictions in the Chinese model have successfully pushed creators to new heights of aesthetic expression and production quality. Creativity can, and demonstrably does, bloom under intense political pressure, and it results in a cinematic atmosphere and symbolic depth that often surpasses the direct and sometimes formulaic narrative of its counterparts. We're left with a clear dichotomy. One model prioritizes explicit truth, the other prioritizes aesthetic depth achieved through inventive constraint.
It is a profoundly complex issue. Both systems produce immense creative and commercial value, one through absolute freedom, the other through navigating stringent restriction. But the listener must ultimately weigh the artistic benefits of cinematic subtlety and high production value against the political and emotional harm of mandated erasure.
The discussion just highlights the inherent trade-offs when creative production exists across these dramatically different global regulatory environments. There's clearly much more to explore on how these limitations influence both the art and, crucially, the audience's psychological experience of it.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. See you in the next one.